Stop the world! Welcome to Stop the World. I'm David Rowe.
And I'm Olivia Nelson.
Today we're speaking about artificial intelligence and security with Lindsay Gorman. Lindsay is Managing Director and Senior Fellow with the German Marshall Fund's Technology Program, LIV. She was a Senior Tech and Security Advisor in the White House under Joe Biden, and she's done a lot of other things, including founding a tech consultancy firm of which she was CEO. She's actually a quantum physicist and computer scientist by background. Liv, I don't know where people find the time to do all these things. I didn't ask her about quantum because then I would have had to go away and relearn it all because it seems to have a shelf life of about 12 hours in my head.
Yeah, you and about 97% of the population, Dave, including me. Mm-hmm. Lindsay surveys the fight between the Pentagon and AI company Anthropic over the guardrails on the technology, AI. She talks about the legitimate concerns of the military, but also the Trump administration's massive overreaction and the terrible signal that sends to companies that want to support national security. She also addresses the bigger question of who controls the technology that is probably the most powerful that humanity has created. What's the role of a state and what's the role of the private sector in all of that?
Yep, big topic of interest to me. Check out my strategist piece if you haven't read it already, folks.
We will drop it in the episode notes.
We talked about the US-China tech race, the Chinese capacity for innovation, very interesting topic, and authoritarian versus democratic governance of AI, which of course is a big geopolitical question around the way that AI evolves and diffuses throughout the world.
And for the third act, you cover AI and democracy and the ways AI could put democracy at risk unless we very actively steer it towards applications that put freedom and human agency at the centre of the technology. The immediate risks are about disinformation and so-called AI slop, the massive fake content, and Lindsay has views on some of the mitigations that we can pursue.
This was one of those conversations that could easily have gone on 3 times as long, Liv, and in fact I've already, with your permission, asked Lindsay to come back sometime soon because we touched on shared passion for the role of AI in enhancing democracy and democratic participation. Big area of interest for me.
AI for good, Dave. Now, watch out for that in the future, but for now, let's listen to you and Lindsay Gorman.
Lindsay Gorman, thanks for coming on Stop the World.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
I want to start on the Anthropic Pentagon battle. There have been, as we're recording, some developments just in the last 12 hours or so. The Pentagon has formally notified Anthropic that it's going to be designated a supply chain risk. There are understandable, reasonable points on both sides of this, I think, and probably the point of view of the military or militaries and their considerations in the way that they use any kind of technology that is supplied to them by the private sector. That's probably been less heard than the tech arguments. Just give me your sort of best assessment on what's the reasonable arguments on both sides here. How do you basically assess this situation?
Well, let me start by saying that I think you're right that there are some reasonable arguments on both sides when it comes to how contracted tech should be used by the Pentagon. Where I don't think there are reasonable arguments, on either side or really on any side, is for why this justifies the supply chain risk designation. Yep. This is a designation we reserve for Chinese providers, Huawei, Russian firms, where we're worried about cyber espionage, we're worried about data theft, we're worried that our literal war plans and the most sensitive strategic communications that we have. And remember, this dispute started based on the Anthropic's use in classified systems. So this is as secretive it gets. Making sure that those sensitive pieces of information don't fall into the hand of our geopolitical rivals and adversaries. That's what the supply chain risk designation is about. So the idea that it would be prescribed in a U.S. company, an AI firm, I don't think there's anything reasonable about that, and it's a massive own goal. Can talk about that more in a minute, but getting to, stepping back to, I think, what your question is about, what's the reasonable arguments here? If there's a charitable description of the Pentagon's position, it's that they want to be able to use contracted tech in whatever lawful way they see fit. That's not crazy. It would be massively inefficient if every time the Pentagon wanted to explore a new use for some technology that it's contracting, it had to call up a company and say, well, does this actually accord with your specific red lines? There is a slippery slope that you can imagine that would not be good for the warfighter, that would not be good for efficiency. I don't really think that's what we're seeing here, though, for a couple reasons. First, these guardrails that Anthropic has insisted on are not contrary to, I think, what the president posted out on Truth Social. These aren't really the radical left, the woke elite guardrails that they're being painted as. We're talking about two specific ones: a prohibition on mass surveillance of Americans, which is very likely already prohibited by U.S. law, and two, the use of AI in fully autonomous weapons. So that would be a human out of the loop. Now, by DoD policy, that too is prohibited. But again, this is a DoD policy that could easily be changed, not a matter of law. So I think that's the first important point, that these two guardrails, are not so far outside the mainstream. I think most Americans and probably most global citizens would say these are pretty reasonable constraints that we want to see from a democracy on AI. The second thing that gives me pause is that in addition to some of the reporting that you mentioned, we also had this development late last week of Sam Altman himself saying that OpenAI has now agreed to fill the gap. They've agreed to a contract with the DoD, with the Pentagon, saying that OpenAI's systems are going to be used in the Pentagon's classified networks. And in fact, that those exact two guardrails, which he says he supports from Anthropic, have been agreed to. So either the Pentagon has agreed to these guardrails for OpenAI when it wouldn't for Anthropic and caused the supply chain designation, maybe it likes OpenAI more than Anthropic, or there's some devil in the details that OpenAI has agreed to that Anthropic has not. But either way, I think it's clearly an outsized response to have the supply chain risk designation placed on a U.S. company. And it's not just about Anthropic, which also, again, not this beacon of sort of liberal woke elites. This is a company that has a strong national security mission that has prioritized working with the national security community. This isn't Google back in 2018, where this is just sort of an employee backlash against general military. No, this is, I think, a company that does want to work in the U.S. national security interests. And so to be designated as supply chain, look, I think they're going to be second order and third order effects here, because what Anthropic has seized on is something that companies throughout U.S. history and throughout U.S. defense innovation have seized on, which is that it's a good business move to do business with the Pentagon. You not only have requirements, you not only have technological development, but you have a ready customer. The DoD is one of the world's largest employers. So if you can crack the national security code as a business, then that opens the door to an enormous amount of contracts, but also to private sector, the ability to upskill in technology and potential private sector pivots after that. This is a path that's been taken by companies like Palantir, that some of the defense tech firms like Anduril are trying to maneuver in. And I think that if there's a true risk to parts of the U.S. innovation edge, if companies that want to do business with the Pentagon for ideological reasons, contractual disagreements, get put in the camp of our fiercest competitors, Huawei, Russian firms. And I do worry that we may be ceding one of our competitive advantages of having this kind of neutral climate for business with that designation. Happy to go into also more what this means kind of for our guardrails on AI as well.
Sure. Look, lots to unpack there. But we can be sympathetic with the principle that is, I suppose, underpinning the military perspective on this, but this is such a spectacularly bad demonstration of the principle, both in terms of the substance they're fighting about, and also the way they're conducting themselves. As you say, they're the sort of coercive overreaction that the Pentagon and Hegseth have used. That it's unfortunately a terrible sort of early test case of what is going to be a bigger and bigger conversation over time. I mean, just looking at the way that Anthropic is used at the moment, I mean, we saw the reports in the Wall Street Journal of the use in the Maduro operation, and now in some of the Iran strikes as well, Khamenei and some of the other leaders, the targeting of those for those strikes. I mean, how significant a kind of own goal is this for the US government right now? As you say, I mean, Anthropic were the only, until recently, the only company that was actually rated to operate at a classified level on these sorts of capabilities. So it does seem as if it's, I mean, how concerned are you that this could be a real kind of blow, I guess, over time to just, to innovation that actually supports the national security mission?
Look, I think over time it can be a huge blow, but it's not because of Anthropic specifically. Look, I think, what I've heard is that they're looking at a 6-month phase out period. So OpenAI can probably fill some of these gaps. It's not, we've also seen reports that Anthropic's Claude was favored among some of these intelligence and defense professionals, but a lot of these systems are roughly equivalent. So it's not, I'm not as worried about an immediate capability gap. And I should say that I also, haven't seen anything that would indicate that either of those red lines were crossed. In the case of the recent military actions that you've described, it seems like they've been used for intelligence and targeting purposes. And I think when we write the history books about these conflicts and the ones to come, it will be a fascinating test case, and really they will be petri dishes for how AI is being used in warfare, along with Ukraine, and some of these exact questions on who does the command and control, who has the final authority, will be one for the history books. I think in not too long of time. So I'm less worried from a U.S. capabilities perspective of how do we engineer this transition between Anthropic to OpenAI, and really more worried for both the public support of AI's use in warfare and what that means for our competitiveness. If we can't set clear guardrails, frankly, these things shouldn't be mediated in contract disputes. And again, this supply chain designation, the Pentagon, could have every right to say, we don't want to work with this company. We don't like something it's doing. The contractual negotiations, we can get a better deal elsewhere. And usually when that happens, you walk away from the negotiation and you just don't do business with that entity. You don't then try to do this company killing move by saying, not only will we not work with you, but any U.S. government entity can't work with you. And anyone who wants to also contract with the U.S. government also can't work with you. This is where the big picture effects on U.S. innovation and U.S. support, innovation support to the warfighter is really going to have the biggest impact, because
in terms of the signal it sends to the industry, right?
Exactly, and exactly the signal to the industry that no longer is it the case that if you can develop great technology that's helpful for the warfighter, do you get the potential for this massive customer that's going to help your development, help your deployment, maybe give you some grants, non-dilutive grant funding as well to prove out your technology. I mean, this is a massive innovation edge that the U.S. has, I think, more so than any country in the world, that many of our strongest technological advancements, came in some way or another from de-risking that the U.S. government did. I mean, all the components of the iPhone, from GPS to the liquid crystal displays, all in some way had to do with government and largely defense funding. I mean, my background's in quantum physics, and my lab was heavily funded by DoD grants. Even though we weren't building quantum computers for the military per se, we were doing the scientific underpinnings of the systems that we're talking about today, and that was funded by the Defense Department. So the signal that it sends to aspiring companies that see the defense industry as an excellent way in for their products. And also, by the way, a way to be patriotic, to help the U.S. national security mission. That's now, I think, called into question when not only you have to question, is that a safe business strategy? It's not just about can you make it technologically, as Anthropic has, but will something in the political wind shift and go not in your way, and then end up having these major repercussions? And of course, I should say that Anthropic has said they're going to contest this in court. If it's true that in fact OpenAI has gone in a very similar direction, I think they'll have a strong case as to not be declared a supply chain risk. But companies may decide it's not worth the risk.
Yeah. Let's just talk for a moment about just this question of the ethics of autonomous lethal force. Are you concerned at all? I mean, for as long as I've been writing about national security, I covered it as a journalist for about 10 years, and from the time I started really sort of reporting on defense, and that was the early days of UAVs and some form of autonomy, way before the real kind of the popular AI revolution really took off post ChatGPT and so forth. But for as long as I've been doing that, this speculative question of what are the ethics of autonomous strike has been a sort of interesting, almost slightly science fiction-y thought experiment for observers and commentators. It feels to me now as if this is one of those, what will be remembered as one of these moments where the rubber sort of hit the road on this issue, and we really, really had to start grappling more seriously with what this means. This basic idea of, what is the sanctity of human life? What are the ethics of having a machine, a non-sentient, non-conscious machine that cannot act as a moral agent, actually making autonomous decisions about human life? And look, even as I say it, I think I feel like I'm going back to these sort of sci-fi speculative, navel gazing conversations. But now suddenly it feels to me as if it's actually a little bit more pressing than it, or considerably more pressing than it has been in the past. Are you worried at all that there is that we could be pulled down a slippery slope on this, particularly if we're looking to the US as being I suppose, the reliable benchmarker on this issue? I have not a huge amount of faith in Beijing to adhere to high principles on this. I have absolutely zero faith in Moscow to adhere to high principles on this. So really, Washington is where we're looking to, and now it feels as if that there might be a bit of a sliver or a crack opened on this issue in a way that we could find, just the pragmatic expectations of the intelligentization of warfare, and the way that's going to speed things up, and the risk that you will be left behind as if your adversaries have lower standards than you on this. How concerned are you about that?
Yeah, I'm quite concerned, but it's not just because of this latest with Anthropic and the Pentagon. I think this Rubicon has already been crossed about a year ago in the context of the Ukraine battlefield, where I've seen reporting that suggests that some of the autonomous and AI-enabled systems deployed have already been making autonomous decisions about not just selecting the targeting, but making these kill decisions. So this is with us now. This is no longer sci-fi. And if anything, I think last week's kerfuffle, my hope is that it would bring more serious attention to a public conversation about exactly these philosophical questions about who do we actually want calling the shots when it comes to how AI systems are deployed in warfare and also in society, because contract negotiations between an AI developer and the government customer are really not the place for what are quite existential questions for humanity and how we want to interact with the next generation of technology in the future. And so it's true that these conversations about the laws, the lethal autonomous weapon systems have been going on for some time, but now we are in a different era where they are being deployed on the battlefield, literally. And so it's no longer a theoretical discussion. But I also take your point. I mean, I think there is a real risk of a race to the bottom. And part of it is with adversaries who likely will not have the same moral stance. But I think there's also a risk, as we're seeing, that there may be guardrails that can be fudgeable. What if the developer down the street is willing to do something that you aren't? Are you going to lose out then because you're holding to a moral standard? And this is what I think what we don't talk about as much as we need to when we're thinking about this rapid deployment of AI, which we need to do. We need to stay ahead, of course, all of that. We can't let our adversaries deploy something faster and then lose out on the battlefield or in any other part of society. Really, if there's a useful technology, we need to be using it. We need to be first. I get all of that. But there is a risk inherent in that approach that these guardrails, these elements that might slow us down even just a teeny bit, will just be completely overtaken in this push to deploy fast at all costs. And I don't know that if we've made that. I don't know that we've made a conscious decision of some of those trade-offs on all these metrics that we want to just push forward at all costs. I don't know that there's been quite a public decision on that.
You raise a really important point that these are significant conversations, and this is the worst possible way to be having them around a contractual dispute. And in fact, what could have been an opportunity to have a broader, more adult, more serious conversation about this, bringing different parties in, whether it's think tankers and institutes like ourselves, the general public, the media. I mean, yes, there's a fair bit of commentary about this, but it doesn't feel as if we're having a particularly constructive conversation about it across the board. So, I mean, what could have been an opportunity hasn't unfolded that way. I am really interested in what the longer term conversation around this looks like. I mean, you've mentioned Sam Altman in some of his public remarks since this all happened. I mean, I've been fascinated by what Altman has said in the past week or so. Understandably, there's some cynicism about everything that he says at the moment because there's this mystifying question around, well, have they lowered their standards? Does the Pentagon, does the administration just like them more than Anthropic? I think that seems to be a serious possibility. That said, Altman has actually tackled head on this broader question of when we have very, very powerful technologies, and this is on track to be the most powerful technology that humanity ever invents, in my view. I mean, do we actually want a private corporation or a private company controlling that? I mean, I would say probably not. Do we want the government to coercively wrest control of it from the private sector? Not really either. What's a new kind of model going forward where you have some kind of, I don't know, some sort of political, social, economic framework in which there is a reason, some sort of democratically steered approach to this technology, given how powerful it's going to be, given the influence that it's going to have over our lives, not just in the, I mean, obviously at the extreme end in the military domain where it's actually taking human lives, but, across the civilian domain as well. It could easily be making decisions about us all the time. In fact, I'm sure it is, at least, with our social media activity and probably our consumer activity as well. What are your views on that longer term conversation about, who steers the most powerful technology that we've ever created?
Yeah, I mean, look, ultimately it has to be steered by humans and it has to be developed for the public benefit. I believe that firmly. And I also believe that there is possibility there that it's not necessarily the case that AI is going to displace every worker. It's gonna, we're gonna need to have a universal basic income because no one's gonna have a job. That the worst versions of humanity will come out. I don't think that's a foregone conclusion at all. And I'm actually quite encouraged by some of the amazing uses of AI. In the scientific and technological fields, for example, the one that I keep coming back to is when I was a researcher, there were people doing PhDs and building their entire careers on solving this one problem in biology about protein folding, because these proteins that are in our body, that are everywhere, how they fold, how they kind of mix up and fold on back on each other, determines their function. And so the thought was, if you could predict how these proteins fold, then you could predict a function of a different protein. And then you could design a protein that goes into pharmaceuticals. You could design different proteins for different types of treatments and cures and all of this. And so this theoretical problem of how do these proteins fold in on each other. Tons of PhDs, tons of faculty positions on this one unsolved problem. And then AI comes in and essentially solves it in a matter of years. To me, that's incredible. So I think there is such opportunity with applying AI to improve the human experience. And it's clear that it needs to be humans. It needs to be the public interest that is the driving force. But I also believe that this isn't going to happen by accident. That if there is not a concentrated effort that involves governments, that involves civil society, that involves people, and that also involves industry, by the way, to build AI that is in the public interest, then we're going to get a repeat of the social media era, where we thought it was going to be this amazing democratizing force. We saw it happening in Tahrir Square. We thought that this was going to be amazing, connecting everyone on its own would lead to this incredible future. But I think we've learned our lesson now. We know that in fact, now you're seeing, countries, I think Australia is also on this list, actually trying to ban or restrict social media, particularly for minors, precisely because of so many of the harms that have come from it in terms of mental health, in terms of...
We have done so, actually. The ban is now in place, so yeah.
Yes, exactly. Australia has really been in the lead on this, and now there are European countries also considering the same. Because there have been so many harms. So I think with AI, in some ways we've seen this movie a bit with social media, where if we don't act intentionally and specifically try to develop this technology in the public interest, then we're not going to end up with an unmitigated good. And in fact, we might end up with the harms outweighing the positives, as I think maybe has been the case, overall on balance when it comes to social media, particularly, and democracy. And I think what this requires is really intentional effort from all of these stakeholders. And so, we've put out work at the German Marshall Fund on this concept of democracy affirming technologies and democratic by design. We also run an exchange with legislators on both sides of the Atlantic for building AI in the public interest. And I think these are the kinds of initiatives that governments and companies really need to seize on, so that they're trying to build technologies that solve societal problems. And by the way, there are so many societal problems out there waiting to be solved, waiting to be cracked open, from, how we do development assistance, in a smoother way, to some of the scientific innovations, to how we cure disease. So there's no shortage of hard, societally relevant problems out there. And sometimes I think the would-be innovators and the current ones need a bit of a prod. They need a push to develop and tackle these problems, as opposed to maybe some of the get-rich-quick schemes that could go either way in terms of the public interest and might actually do more harm than good.
That leads very nicely to a discussion about China, because, of course, the other front runner in this technology beyond democratic United States is, of course, non-democratic China. So, straight away, there's this first question of, given that, insofar as this is at the front of this race, there are basically two competitors, and one of them is not democratic, raises big questions about the prospects for infusing democratic values into the technology itself, as it, given the technology will diffuse around the world, and there are, for every country on earth outside of the United States and China, they are going to have options about what sort of technology they use and where that's supplied from. And so the diffusion and the sort of values that get diffused through that process was going to be a very interesting process to watch. But perhaps first of all, just give me some overview thoughts on the way you think that the Chinese Communist Party is actually approaching artificial intelligence and the governance of artificial intelligence and the steering of it, and I mean, how concerned do you think they are that, their of course, notorious insistence on control could actually be imperiled by a technology that is as powerful as artificial intelligence? And are you concerned at all that, in a kind of perverse irony, that the CCP type model of government, which is all about, the state's dominance over the private sector, is actually going to be a more pragmatic, a more effective model for the governance of AI than a democratic states?
Yeah, I mean, so much to unpack there, and maybe
a long-winded question.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the great thing about the U.S.-China AI race competition. There are so many different facets of it, but that means that there's so many battlefields for the competition, and I don't think we can afford to ignore any of them. But to maybe starting with where you left off on the role of state direction and whether kind of top-down ecosystem can be better for AI governance and competitiveness, and I would say no. In its best incarnation, I really do believe in a pluralistic system. And I think this is kind of what is under threat, though, by the way, when there are questions about potential questions about ideology influencing the government contracting decisions. That actually is kind of exactly the model that our autocratic rivals like China are embracing, where they're saying, all AI systems have to conform to Chinese socialist characteristics. Can't put out anything. The AI can't spit out anything about Xi Jinping. Can't spit out any a picture of Winnie the Pooh, because that is also verboten, because some resemblance between Xi and Winnie. Yeah. I don't think that's good for innovation, and I'm not saying that's the direction the U.S. is necessarily is headed in, but that there are really strong advantages to a pluralistic system, both from a point of view of creativity. I mean, the fact that, for example, Claude Code, which has now taken the world by storm, people are creating these amazing tools by vibe coding Claude Code. I mean, that was developed by an engineer just kind of on his spare time working for Anthropic. That wasn't something that even had company level direction, much less government direction. So I really think that freedom to experiment is such a critical asset. And at the end of the day, if fostered, we'll win. We'll win the competition. But it's not as simple as saying, go do, and we'll figure it out. There does need to be this interplay between state investment and at times state de-risking of certain technologies that maybe are too risky right now, where the economics don't quite work out for the private sector to invest in. That's where I think industrial policy does have a place, and the state should be taking these bets. China's doing that to the extreme, and there are positives and negatives of that approach. What we've seen from China and AI, I think, has been quite impressive. Some of the recent statistics I looked at in robotics are that China in just the last year installed 295,000 industrial robots, which is nearly 9 times as many as the US and more than the rest of the world combined. They have over 2 million operational robots, and many of the factories and industrial sites are actually that are using these innovations and productivity gains from AI are actually in China. So the adoption game, is really quite important, and this is where also China's focus on the open weight models. They're not competitive right now with the top frontier labs in the U.S., Anthropic, OpenAI, etc. When it comes to the most sophisticated models that are closed weight. But just like we saw with intense intellectual property theft and espionage across sectors before AI, now China's coming up with interesting and maybe frankly a little ingenious ways to distill against in violation of some of these companies' terms of service, of course, but to distill information from the models by constantly pinging them with with queries to try to understand how can we reverse engineer this. I mean, frankly, it's kind of brilliant from an industrial competition standpoint. And then I think there's a real risk that they'll just sort of package this up, maybe come up with the 80% version of it, but release it way cheaper. We saw this with Huawei and 5G. There were cases of actual technology theft, physical technology theft, but also some of these more creative ways of doing partnerships and research partnerships to build the technology and leapfrog the United States and Europe on 5G and now 6G. So I think we're at a real risk of seeing the exact same thing play out with AI adoption, and this is a great strategy that China is really leaning into, deploying DeepSeek. I think it's now in 260 hospitals across China, and we'll absolutely, I think, see this across the Belt and Road Initiative and many of China's international partnerships. In terms of how AI is being adopted among businesses, there are also vast discrepancies country by country there. As of 2024, I think it was that 78% of U.S. businesses used AI. So that's, I think, a pretty strong number, whereas only just over half of Chinese businesses were using AI in at least one business process last year. But on the other hand, it's 87% of Chinese employees are using AI at least several times a week. So it's more of this bottom-up implementation of AI. And I think that's really also what's going to be key to understanding what are the real use cases that are going to make businesses more efficient. So, the race is on for sure. But one other point I would make is that this isn't a race that, I think almost a race or a marathon, a sprint. Neither of these are really quite the right analogy, because it implies a finish line where you cross it, someone's declared a winner, and then we all go home. That's not how this works. In fact, it's we're constantly running, loops around the track over and over again. If you just watch the Olympics, it's like the cross country ski races where they do the same track over and over and over again. And then maybe the biathlon, they come and they have to shoot in the meantime. But there's not an end point to this. So it's going to be constant development, constant attempts from China to get the latest capabilities to outperform the United States and other democracies. And if we think we're ahead at one point, that could change in another year or 2 or 5.
Right. I want to clarify one thing, because I think it's a really important point. Do you believe that the political culture in China, that sort of that repressive tendency, does genuinely mean that grassroots innovation is something that isn't going to sort of organically propel them forward, and they do have to rely on things like, distillation of large language models or IP theft going back to, fighter planes and all the rest of it? And has China's, I suppose, defiance of those predictions from 15, 20 years ago and going further back, that they weren't ever going to be able to innovate like the United States was. I mean, their defiance of those predictions, it seems to me. I mean, do you take pause from that?
Yeah, I mean, look, those predictions were clearly wrong. China is not just a nation of copycats, and that's very clear from anyone who's been there, anyone who's seen the technology coming out. It's clearly good. It's clearly innovative. There's nothing about the Chinese spirit that isn't just as competitive and just as innovative, I think, as anywhere else in the world. I think on the margins, it's still the case that more scientists, more thinkers want to live in a country and in a society that's freer. So that's an inherent advantage. Is it the whole game? No. And it's incredible that Chinese entrepreneurs, Chinese scientists have been able to thrive and make some of the advances that they have, frankly, in a repressive climate. So it's clearly not one or the other. It's clearly not the case that innovation is impossible in repressive environments. And I think that we see that elsewhere in the world too. With the spotlight on Iran these days, there are some incredible Iranian scientists that have just as much to bring to the table as anyone else in the world. And what democracies really need to do is provide that environment where the best engineers from the free and the repressive societies of the world want to come here and develop their innovations and develop and build their companies. And we encourage them to do that. But I mean, even the data show that there's been an explosion in terms of Chinese AI scientists over the last quarter century to a place where China is in the lead or near the lead in many areas of AI when it comes to research production and publication. So yes, this is not we can't rest on our laurels just because we've got some nice principles in our freer societies. That means we're definitely going to win. That was clearly a wrong assumption, and we're in the race because of it.
I mean, it's just thinking as you were reflecting as you were speaking there. I mean, it's all the more reason why the Trump administration should think very carefully about trying to crush the work of their leading AI lab as well. I mean, that's the sort of irony of that is it was apparent even as you were talking. And at the risk of being silly, I tweeted earlier this week that if Anthropic wants a freer and more congenial environment in which to operate, they're very welcome to come and set up in Australia. We'd be very happy to have them here. We've got some fiddly copyright law issues that we need to sort out first. Okay, let's touch on AI and democracy. I'm conscious of the time, but this is a big area of your work. I know that you've written about it recently, about areas like combating disinformation and embedding democratic values in artificial intelligence. Perhaps just give me a sort of a broad view to start with. I mean, how optimistic on the current trends that you're seeing of, I suppose, the dynamic between the technology and governments around the world and societies around the world, where are the areas that you're optimistic that artificial intelligence is actually enhancing democracy and democratic values and will continue to do so? And what are the areas where you're pessimistic on that question?
Yeah, I mean, the optimistic one is a hard one to find because, truth be told, I'm not seeing so much in the connection between AI and democracy explicitly that's positive. But what I will say, beyond just the core democracy issues, elections, media, strong institutions, and I guess there are some examples of that. There was an example of an anti-corruption AI minister coming out of Europe, where it was not just a minister for AI, but actually an AI agent that was appointed to deal with anti-corruption. So I think there are some really interesting use cases. I don't want to be overly pessimistic, but I think that case, those cases are few and far between right now. And we really need a bigger push to try to look at some of these societal questions that are fundamental to democracy and say, how can we use AI to help solve them? How can we increase transparency? I mean, I think there's incredible opportunity, with anti-corruption, with, understanding, even with access to data sets, on political parties, on exposing some of this corruption. For example, to be able to shine a light, even things, shining light on biases and hiring. I mean, this was a famous kind of AI misuse where it turned out that AI was surfacing resumes of particular genders and races above others. And this is an example, used as an example for why AI is biased and AI is problematic for these values. But actually, if you flip it around, maybe can expose some of the inherent biases that we have as humans. And I think this could be applied, not just for racial and gender, but it could be applied for so many different discoveries of how we're doing things now and how we could do things better.
So it was inheriting the biases from the data sets that it was trained on, correct?
Exactly. Right. Okay. And in fact, in some ways elucidating those biases that they already existed because they were, present in our data sets of how we're normally doing things.
And we were less likely to see them because we couldn't see the entire data sets.
Exactly.
So we could tell ourselves that we're not biased. Yeah.
Precisely. And so I think that, this is just one example. Like the corruption minister idea is another example of how these systems can be used in tremendous and powerful ways to improve society and improve democracy, potentially make democracies more responsive to their people. There's a whole movement of using AI for more participatory democracy. Mm-hmm. Now, where I'm pessimistic is that I haven't really seen any of these solutions bubble to the surface in a meaningful way. I haven't seen huge investment in them. What we do see is a littered landscape of AI slop, of images and videos now around every major news event and political event that are generated by AI. We put out a piece with the Tech Policy Press in the follow up to this India AI Summit, which was really focused exactly on this question of making AI diffusion happen so that it lifts people up around the world and improves actual lives. There could be a democracy nexus there. We need to make sure that democracies are actually delivering economically for our populations. And can AI help with that to make sure that democracy is still a good deal economically in the 21st century? So there's that piece of it. But we put out this piece following the India AI Summit because what we've seen over the last few months is every single news event, whether it was the protests in Iran earlier this year or protests, in the United States here, every event has its own swath of AI generated content. And we know that the social media environment is not one where people are stopping and thinking and checking sources. They're just sharing and sending it on, maybe putting a caption to support a particular narrative. And this has completely exploded now with AI. Just exactly, I hate to fashion myself and others as these like horrible prognosticators of doom. But I mean, we've been talking about this for now 5 or 6 years, that this could happen, that deepfakes would become so mainstream that this line between fact and fiction would blur and would vanish. And unfortunately, I think that is really where we're headed, if not where we are, where content is flying all over the place. No one's really checking to see if it's AI generated or not, if it's AI tweaked. And this is extremely dangerous for democracy because we need to have good sources of information. These are the environments that autocrats thrive in because you can't tell which way is up. You can't tell what's right and what's wrong. And so you tune out. That's the natural psychological human response. You say, I can't figure this out. I'm going to think about something else, not these really salient, political, societal issues. So I think that's really danger number one. Danger number two that I'm personally worried about is related, but it's also the future of the media ecosystem. We haven't had the best track record when it comes to supporting local journalism, when it comes, as societies, as democracies, in making sure that journalism exists through technological change. But this is the fourth estate. This is a fundamental pillar of democratic systems. And I worry that it's not prepared for the AI revolution. What it means in terms of should AI be writing headlines? Should AI be writing articles? Should AI help target content on particular news stories to individuals that might be more interested in one element and a quote from this person than another? Maybe you're really interested in how a technology development between Anthropic and the Pentagon is going to play out for Australia. Maybe you would want a quote from someone, and you'd want to read a quote from someone in the article who might comment on whether we might see a turn of Anthropic going more towards U.S. allies and partners like Australia. Whereas at the German Marshall Fund, we might want to see how that applies to Europe. What if you could just tailor your news articles to fit the individual? That could be very compelling from a business perspective. But what does that mean for democracies? Then do we have a different understanding of the facts? And how do news organizations actually stay relevant in an era where we can also just go to AI systems for the updates? We can ask these chatbots, what's happened this week? And if that's easier than going to a journalistic outlet, then more and more of us will start doing that. So I don't think media has figured out how it's going to stay relevant, how it's going to adopt AI, and also ensure its own integrity through this technological disruption. And so that's number two that I really worry about when it comes to AI and democracy.
Right. I mean, the issue of participation and how we might actually enhance democratic participation, I mean, I'll be signing you up to a double shift podcast here if I get into that. I feel like I want to have you back to talk about that as a separate issue, because I find that incredibly fascinating. But we'll park that and we'll stick on the disinformation and media thing. I mean, as a former journalist, of course, I very much appreciate what you're saying. It seems to me that just if you look at the phrase generative artificial intelligence as a starting point, I mean, just the fact that something can generate a perfect or a near perfect equivalence of reality, or the appearance of reality, straight away that tells me this is going to be devastating for a form of government that relies, as you say, on facts. Democracies don't work without facts unless people have facts on which they can base their voting decisions, and unless they can, unless they can participate based on a clear, truthful, factual understanding of what is going on in the society they live in, then the whole system ceases to function. So it seems to me that this is, unless we find very, very clever mitigations to get around that, this, I suppose the weight of momentum is unfortunately on the downside here, which is just this colossal force kind of ripping through the democratic process. What you're describing around some of the mitigations to that, it feels to me, I mean, look, I'm sure some of them will help, and we need to put them in place, but at the same time, it just still feels as if it's going to be a giant leaky net there, unless we make ourselves as citizens the ultimate sort of backstops against all of this. And your point, I think, about news media models, the news media business model that I would like to see going forward is to raise generations of children and young people who decide, I actually want to part with my own money to fund good journalism because I appreciate the value of factual news reporting and giving me a better understanding of the reality of the society I live in. That, to me, is the sort of perfect outcome. I have absolutely no idea of how we get there, given that we're awash in the slop that you talked about. Sorry, this is now turning into a lecture. But look, yeah, could you perhaps just, and perhaps as a way of sort of starting to wrap up, perhaps you could just reflect on that for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think not all hope is lost there. I mean, I am quite, on balance, I am pessimistic when it comes to AI and the media and information environment. But there are some media companies who have managed to navigate, and I think do exactly what you're saying, which is provide something that's of value, that people choose, that they want reporting that, upholds journalistic standards, that they're getting something that is more than the AI slop. And I think the optimist in me, to the extent that it's there, I think that's true potentially of the creative industry as well, that ultimately what resonates with us with an amazing piece of art or an amazing play or a piece of music is not something that I've seen AI replicate yet. And in some ways, it's also a response to our times, our culture, our political environment. These things that really strike a chord are uniquely human. So I do think there's a way forward. And I would also add that, part of our work is about that actually technology itself has a role to play there. That, one of the technical movements that I'm such a huge champion of with democracy affirming technologies is on content provenance technologies, because what they're doing is providing these sort of tamper resistant histories for images and videos and how they've been captured and modified along the way, from when they're either generated by an AI system or taken by a camera to when they appear in your social media feed. So you can actually see, it's just, radical transparency. You can see how an image has been manipulated, how it's been modified. I mean, incredible implications even beyond democracy to, retouching and, did you edit that cover, that magazine cover in a certain way? And I think prioritizing some of these values like transparency, that in a way that lets the reader decide for themselves, not dictating, is this true? Is this false? Because we run into this question of, well, who gets to decide what's true and what's false? Yeah. But actually just providing information and saying, just like when we read an article, we can tell if it's well cited. If we can go back to the source that's cited and read that and say, well, does that actually make the point that's being claimed in the first article that's citing it? We can do that work ourselves. That's what we need for the images and video, where we can just have more information to draw. And so I think, and some of these technologies are trying to do just this, to provide transparency, to empower the user and the reader to do more, and also to expect to care about that, and to expect that information is there. So I don't think all hope is lost. I think technology also has a role to play, and innovators and entrepreneurs who aren't born and don't graduate from college thinking let's destroy democracy. In fact, there I think is incredible ingenuity that could be harnessed for that purpose. And I don't know, when I was in Silicon Valley, now I guess 15 years ago, I think there's much more of a desire to do something in the public interest among this generation also of engineers and innovators, and so it really is about harnessing that against what if we do it, if we're not deliberate about it, if we don't specifically invest in this public interest technology, there's no reason to think it will be developed that way.
And the social media example that you mentioned earlier on, that resonates for me, because that, to me, there's something. What's truly tragic about the outcomes of social media is that we've ended up with outcomes that nobody really sought or really wanted. It was just the commercial incentives and these various other incentives that people were pursuing just got us. Nobody wants teenage girls to become anorexic from watching social media. Unless you're a complete completely malevolent, but they're just the risk with AI is that we go down that same path of outcomes that nobody actually wants if they stopped and thought about it. But unfortunately, the machine kind of keeps on rolling, and we go down those pathways.
I would also maybe just a last point on that is that I would say this is a failure of technology and society, that we're ending up in the place of bans, of banning a technology for a certain age group. That means we failed to develop something that's useful for all segments of society, and to have guardrails on it that are appropriate, and to steer its development in a way that's beneficial. I think that's not a great outcome for technology. Yeah. And if that's where we end up with AI, where we just need to ban it, that means we've screwed up somehow in guiding its development.
Absolutely, and that's what as a matter of principle, I understand the reasons to dislike the ban, but from a practical point of view, and to be honest, speaking as a parent, I'm 100% behind it. Mind you, that said, I think I have authoritarian streaks, because I would be very happy being the sole arbiter of what's true and what's false. I think. Who decides? I do. All right. Well, look, Lindsay, that's been a really fascinating conversation. We've gone over time, as I tend to do, but look, thank you for coming on. I'd love to have you back and talk about some more of these ideas, and particularly that idea of participation in democracy. I think that's going to be such a fascinating conversation going forward. So thanks for coming on Stop the World, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.
Yes, thanks so much for having me. This was so interesting.
Thanks for listening, folks. We will be back next week with more Stop the World.